Hey everyone. Today in this video, I'll be sharing some thoughts on the US migration crisis. Immigration is a topic which has seen much growth in mainstream discourse, especially since Trump's ran for the presidency a second time. It can sometimes feel as though there's a great deal of disinformation and misinformation around this topic. So the following is my attempt to bring to light some pertinent information about the topic and do my part to combat miseducation in this area. Let's begin. I hope you enjoy the video.
So, one of the most common sentiments I hear consistently about immigration is that migrants take U.S. citizens' jobs or otherwise hurt us economically. This sentiment isn't necessarily wrong in my view. On some level, I can see the logic as to why immigration would hurt us economically. When you take a look at things from a supply and demand style economic perspective, the more workers there are, migrants included, the less likely any individual one of us is to get a job. In addition, the more people there are, the less an employer would have to pay the worker they even hired. If there's 10 of you, I get paid the one I hired a little. But if there's only 2 or 3 of you, then you're that much rare, so you're going to get paid more because of that. So I can understand this point of view and what the Trump administration is doing logically. However, just stopping the debate on migration here is disingenuous and leaves out 2 major points. The first point being, many migrants work jobs Americans don't want to work, such as in agriculture and construction, where they do things like plant and harvest crops out in the sun. They get paid lower wages for these jobs than a U.S. citizen would, and those savings make things like your groceries cheaper because the labor cost to produce them is cheaper. And the second point, the skilled migrants that would actually compete for the jobs we want, such as in the tech sector, are being allowed in anyway by the Trump administration through programs such as the H-1B visas. Beyond these facts, when we take a bird's eye view look at immigration overall, we would find immigrants net contribute to the economy through their labor, consumption, and taxes. A nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office report found adding immigrants as workers and consumers would boost the economy by $7 trillion over a number of years, as well as increase tax revenue by $1 trillion. Now you might ask, can they really be a net benefit if they consume social services provided by the government? Well, research done by the Libertarian Cato Institute found first-generation immigrants pay on average $1.38 in taxes for every $1 in social services they receive. This gap in input and output is even larger for the undocumented, who are excluded from almost all federal benefits and lack documents to get services such as Medicaid, food stamps, or Social Security, despite paying into them. So records suggest immigrants produce more than they take economically, but what about drugs and crime? Well, an U.S. attorney found 80% of people prosecuted and convicted of federal drug trafficking offenses were U.S. citizens. Furthermore, federal records show 90% of fentanyl, cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine is seized at legal border crossings or checkpoints, not illegal ones. Concerning just crime and not drugs, in 2018, the state of Texas found an illegal immigration criminal conviction rate of just 782 people per 100,000, or around 0.78%, which compared to 1.42 for native-born Americans was a relatively low crime rate. The aforementioned statistics are a few of the numbers various parts of the government have gathered over the years. Someone could argue pretty easily the migration of foreign workers is a net benefit to society. But this is only half the story concerning migration, the domestic, inside America side. On a macro level, when we zoom out to the international level, one could argue America itself is creating the very conditions on the ground that produce wave after wave of migrants coming to the country in the first place. This other half of the migration story, concerning the root causes of migration, why those from South America even bother coming, has a lot to do with something you may have heard of before, known as the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was a U.S. policy first started in the 1800s, which forbade European powers from interfering with, colonizing, or otherwise exploiting Latin American countries, because the U.S., wanted these lands and resources for its own sphere of influence. The policy, while not as strong as it once was in the golden age of imperialism, nonetheless persists to the present era and can arguably be blamed, at least in part, for some of the migration we see today on the southern border. In Cuba, for instance, before the revolution, by the late 1950s, U.S. interests owned 90% of Cuban mines and mineral concessions, 80% of its public utilities, including almost the entire oil industry, 40% of its sugar production, and 25% of its bank deposits, totaling about $1 billion. Now, imperialism is bad no matter who does it, don't get me wrong, but it'd be one thing if we all shared in the spoils of it. But spoiler alert, we don't. Anyway, before I digress, let's link this point back to the migration crisis. Between 1960 and 1996, the country of Guatemala fought a civil war between an exploitative authoritarian government and opposing forces that likely wanted to nationalize their country's resources. During this conflict, the U.S. provided intelligence, training, and armed support to the Guatemalan government, and this model of intervention was repeated in various Central American countries that we see large amounts of migrants coming from today.
Will we permit the Soviet Union to put a second Cuba, a second Libya, right on the doorstep of the United States?
Almost 1 million Nicaraguans, Salvadorians, Hondurans, and Guatemalans fled to the United States between 1980 and 1991 to escape either political repression or economic hardship. And the number of migrants from these areas has continued to rise year after year since these interventions. As an investigative reporter put the issue plainly, we're dealing with it from a military perspective. Build a wall, put more boots on the ground, incarcerate people. We're not dealing with the root causes of migration. We're not touching the root causes of migration. If the U.S. took a new 21st century foreign policy stance, where we worked with these countries collaboratively to help reduce violence, increase economic activity, and build up their institutions, we would radically reduce the amount of migration coming to us from this area of the world. We would be solving the issue at its source. To continue what we have been doing would be to engage in a cynical game, wherein we pursue a foreign policy that is causing more migration, then act surprised when more and more migrants arrive, as if we don't know the reason. We can do better if we know better. Many thanks for watching the video. If you watched to the end, through the whole thing, I really appreciate that. These are some thoughts on the U.S. migration crisis on our border.